Hello and welcome back. We've been doing an overview of the Bible starting at creation, where we saw a picture of what God wanted life to look like. Then the fall, where we saw all the things that God wanted life to be just completely fall apart. Eventually, God called a man named Abraham, and he made a promise to Abraham saying, I'll give you land, descendants to live in that land, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob. Jacob was his name was changed to Israel. He had 12 sons, and the sons of Jacob became known as the 12 tribes of Israel as they grew. They ended up enslaved in Egypt. They were being oppressed, beaten, even killed. And God sent Moses to lead them out of Egypt. And when the people came out of Egypt, God made a covenant with these people. The people had a role and God had a role. So the people's role was to obey what we call the law. And this is 613 different commandments. And if the people kept the law, they kept their end of the covenant, then God's role would be to bless them beyond anything they could possibly imagine. If they broke the covenant, they would end up cursed and destroyed, much like the nation that they were about to judge. Well, the people went up and into the land of Canaan, and this Canaan was the land that God was judging. God said these people have become so steeped in sin that they're literally killing one another brutally, and it's like an infection that's going to spread to other parts of the world. We need to rid the world of these people and any trace of their culture. And God's people went in and did the job, sort of. They didn't do it exactly the way God said, and because of that, they ended up following these same gods. They were doing the same things that these other people were doing. And we get into this spiral then, where the people would start following other gods, the gods of the Canaanites, and then God would say, okay, let's let the Canaanite gods protect you, and the Lord would send in an enemy, and they would be oppressed, and they'd be starving to death. They'd cry out to the Lord for help, and the Lord would raise up a judge to judge the enemies of God's people. And then things would be going well, and they'd be following the Lord, and they'd relax and settle down and start worshiping the Canaanite gods again, and the same thing would happen over and over and over. And we see this downward spiral to a point where things that were just understood in culture, people exaggerate all the time, and people would say things like, take my daughters instead of my guests, abuse my daughters, but don't mess with my guests. And it was understood to mean, I have an obligation to protect my guests, and I will fulfill that obligation. And if you ask for my daughters, you're going to get a shotgun to your face. But the understanding on both sides was, this saying means I will protect my guest at all cost. Well, we get into this downward spiral where things got so bad that this man just took it literally, threw his own wife, his concubine, out to a bunch of men, and they gang raped her all night, and he got up and just said, get up, let's go. This is how far we've come. That prompted a civil war which almost destroyed one of the tribes, and in this really horrible time, probably one of, if not the lowest point in the history of Israel, we get this little glimmer of hope in the book of Ruth. So if you are following along in the Bible, we're starting out in the book of Ruth today. But that's the context for the book of Ruth. It came about in the days when the judges governed. So it came about at this time period when things were going so horribly wrong, and God's people were worshiping all these other gods. Everybody did right in his own eyes, is how the book of Judges describes it. There was no God in Israel, and the Lord was supposed to be their God. King. Brain burps. But there was no king in Israel. That phrase is repeated over and over again in the book of Judges. And God, the Lord, was supposed to be their king. But they rejected God as their king. They wanted a human king to lead them, and there was no human king yet. And this is the setting for the whole book of Ruth. So during this time when the judges governed, there was a famine in the land. A certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. Now there are 2 different psalms that refer to Moab as a lot of translations say God's wash basin, and the meaning of the word most likely is God's toilet, God's bedpan, God's toilet. So Moab is considered God's toilet. Well, these people lived in Bethlehem. And the town Bethlehem, the name Bethlehem actually comes from two Hebrew words, house and bread. Bethlehem is literally translated house of bread. And there was a famine in the house of bread. So when there's a famine in the house of bread, you know it's bad. And it was better to go live in Moab, God's toilet, than it was to live in the house of bread. So this man and his wife and his two sons went to Moab. And then we get their names. The man was named Elimelech, and that name, the man's name, was also from two Hebrew words, meaning my God is king. So my God is king is the man. Naomi, her name means pleasant. So my God is king and Naomi, pleasant, got married. And they had two sons. The two sons were named Mahlon and Chilion. Well, the name Mahlon means sick or sickly, weak. Chilion means wasting away. So the names of these children really describe very clearly what's going on here. The famine is so severe that these two children are sickly and wasting away. And so they left to go live in God's toilet. Well, these two children, the two sons, grew up and they married. And they married women from Moab. So two Moabite women. Now, if Moab is God's toilet, think about how a Moabite woman would do living in Israel, right? Probably not very well. The people of Moab were not very well liked by the people of Israel. They did not get along. Well, this family, they intermarry with the Moabites, and so these two young girls are Moabite girls. But the two boys, they died. Mahlon and Chilion died, and the husband died. Elimelech, my God is king, he died. So here is pleasant Naomi with these two young women, the daughters-in-law, and Naomi says, listen, even if I could possibly find a way to remarry, by the time I had children, and those children are old enough for you to marry, it's going to be too late, right? And the chances of that happening are slim to none. You're actually better off going back to your home, your family's home in Moab, and which is where they're living, but go back to your family's household and stay there. You'll have a much better chance of being able to remarry and start a new life. But as for me, Naomi said, I'm returning to Bethlehem. I'm returning to Israel. Well, the girls were really upset about this. They genuinely loved one another. And one of the girls agreed, I don't like this, but yes, it's best, and she returned home. But the other one, named Ruth, decided, no, Naomi, wherever you go, I'll go. Your people will be my people, your God will be my God. And Naomi really tried to talk her out of it, but couldn't. And so Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem. When she got there, all the people said, hey, isn't this Naomi? Isn't this pleasant? And she said, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. And apparently she was. She said, I left this place full and I'm returning empty. Well, she left the place because she was empty. She had nothing. There was a famine. She could barely live. And now she comes back thinking, man, I didn't know how much I had. I was full back then. Now I'm empty. So here's Naomi then living with this Moabite girl. Nobody around would really be very fond of this Moabite girl. But this Moabite girl, Ruth, she started to learn the customs, the traditions, the law, right? The covenant God made with the people. And that covenant provided in a way for the poor of the area. So if you have a large field and you are gathering crops, a couple things you're required to do by the Torah, the law. Right? First, you don't gather the harvest from the very edges of your field. You leave that for the poor. So the poor can come, and they're welcome to come right up to the edges of the field and just, take some grain, gather grain, enough to feed themselves. They're working for it. They have some sustenance. And in an honor and shame culture, you would gain honor by allowing the poor to do this. Even though it was kind of, mandated in the Torah. Well, another thing, is after, when it's harvest time, after you go through your fields and you harvest your fields, you don't go back and find all the little scraps that dropped on the way out. You just leave them, and the poor are allowed to come into your fields and gather these little scraps that you drop. So Ruth found out about these things and said, why don't I go do that? Well, the problem is, Ruth, again, is a Moabite girl, right? As a Moabite, she really would not be very welcome in these fields, right? Legally, according to the Torah, she can do this, but she's not going to be welcome as a Moabite girl. And so there would be a lot of other young women trying to go through and do the same thing. They would be kind of throwing elbows, and they not feeling at all bad about it. What's this Moabite doing here? Get her. That's mine. Don't touch that. They'd be taking stuff out of her hands, and not only that, but she's just learning the laws and customs. She doesn't know how far in she can go. She doesn't know the little details and nuances yet of where she can gather grain, where she can't. And the people are going to give her a really, really hard time. So here she is out in the field. She found a field nearby, and she's out in the field doing the best she can to gather grain. And I'm sure people were really giving her a rough time. She was not having the best day of her life, I'm sure, and just trying to figure it all out. Well, meanwhile, the owner of the field, Boaz, comes home, and he pulls up in his SUV, right? Pulls through the little dirt trail in the center of the field and looks up and hears this woman he hasn't seen before. And he kind of looks and he's like, she's cute. And, the guy in the passenger seat says, Boaz, that's that Moabite girl. You don't have anything to do with her. He's like, so what? She's Moabite. She's cute. And he invites her to lunch. So they have lunch together. And he actually then orders the servants, I know she's probably going to be messing things up here and there. Don't give her a hard time. Just let her go. And the servants are like, really? That Moabite girl? Right? I wouldn't even let her stay here. You want her to, get stuff that she's not allowed to get? Boaz says, yeah, don't worry about it. In fact, you know what? Do this. If she's around you, just accidentally drop a little bit of grain so that she has more to pick up. But let's send her home full. And then he ends up giving her like these bags of grain to bring home to Naomi. And they hit it off real well, the two of them. So Boaz has a thing for this Moabite girl, and Ruth she doesn't seem to mind him so much either. And she goes home and tells Naomi all about it. And at some point, toward the end of the harvest season, there's always this big party, right? You gather your crops, and whatever you have, it's this big, huge celebration. And at this party, then there's some trading. You're getting set to trade some of your crops for whatever you need, whether it's finances or other goods or whatever. But you're gathering the crops. Your servants are bringing in the last of the crops you're gathering, and then when everything's done, you and your servants, your whole household, which would be huge if you're doing well, if you have a big plot of land like this, if you're successful, you'd have a lot of people there helping out, and you throw this big, huge party. Right, there would be wine flowing, a lot of celebrating. These people really did know how to party, and it's just a really good time. So Naomi and Ruth, meanwhile, have a little bit of a crisis on their hands because the season is ending, and if once the season ends, where are they going to get food? Right, they've been storing up, I'm sure, some of the grain, but how long is it really going to last? So they got to survive the whole next season until the next year's crops are going to come in. It's going to be a rough time, a rough journey. Well, Naomi thinks through this and starts to piece together, wait, this guy you're talking about, what was his name again? Boaz. I remember Boaz. He's actually a distant relative. Well, in the Torah, this covenant God made with the people, one thing that was specified was this. If you... Say me and my brother, I marry, I'm the older brother. Suppose I die and I have no children. Well, in this worldview, in this culture, the thinking is if my identity, it's not about me as an individual, it's about the whole family. The collective is more important than the individual. So my identity has directly to do with my family line, forward and backward. So if I die and I have no male children, then my identity ceases to exist. If I have daughters only, there's a nuance in the law that my daughters would, when they marry, right? If I die, my daughters marry. The husbands then would be considered legally adopted by me, so they become my sons and carry on my family line. There's a little nuance in the law. So as long as you have children of some sort, you're okay. But if you have no children, your family line ceases to exist. Your whole, that part of the family line is done, which means your identity is gone. You live on in that culture by your identity carrying on through your children and great-great-grandchildren and etc. So you're considered cursed if you have no children. Well, that nuance in the Torah then says that if I die, my brother has to marry my wife and have children through her on my behalf, so that through my brother, my family line carries on. But not all brothers wanted to, they were not necessarily into their sisters-in-law. And, even if they got along well, that puts their own family line in jeopardy, because you're now potentially getting into a situation where you need to start splitting your inheritance. Your finances are spent raising this child on behalf of your brother, and it really affects you. So not everybody's willing to do that. If you don't do that, it's horrible, it's shameful. But not some people would endure the shame rather than take that risk. So you basically have this succession of families. So if I don't have a brother, or in some cases the brother dies as well, the next nearest relative steps up in that role. Well, Naomi realizes Boaz is a distant relative, right? Both my sons are dead. It's not like one of my sons can marry the other's wife and carry on the family line. They're both dead. What do we do now? The husband's dead. Everybody, the whole part of the family is dead. They've been gone from Bethlehem for a long time. So now that they're back, she just remembers he's a distant relative. He is actually eligible to marry Ruth. And if he marries Ruth, we're in good shape, right? Plus, as a distant relative, the other thing that happens is you can actually buy back land that was sold, or, if I get into financial trouble and have to sell my land to somebody, my brother would have the right to buy back that land on my behalf. And it would be his, and then at some point it would return back to my family line. So these are all things that this guy can do. He's called the kinsman redeemer. He redeems his kin. So that's what that's all about. Well, Naomi then says, Ruth, I have a plan. And they start, whispering. They run out to the store. They spend a little bit of money that they've come across on a nice, beautiful dress. Naomi tells Ruth, take a bath, take a nice warm bath. You put on some perfume, make sure you're clean, you smell nice, brush your teeth, take all the appropriate steps. And then they're going to have this party. So you're going to wear this new dress that we got, put your best clothes, put on some makeup. Go find out at the party, just kind of go show up. Look around and find him, but don't let anybody really notice you. Don't let him see you. Don't sneak around like a ninja, but don't look conspicuous. Just kind of stay in the outskirts. But at nighttime, when everybody starts going to sleep, watch and see where he goes to sleep. And when he lies down, notice the place. You shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what to do. And she said, okay, right? I don't get it. I sneak in after he's asleep and uncover his feet and lie down at his feet. Okay, whatever, I'll do it. Well, she went. She did everything that Naomi had told her. Boaz had eaten and drunk. His heart was merry, right? He had a few glasses of wine. He was feeling pretty good. Everybody's starting to go to sleep. And he went to the end of a huge heap of grain and just kind of dug out a little nick in there and settled himself in, started going to sleep. Well, there's Ruth paying attention to where he was. So in the middle of the night, everybody was asleep. She went and snuck in, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Well, it happened that the man was startled in the middle of the night and leaned forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your maid. So spread out your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. Right, well, what on earth heck does all that mean? So I'm going to skip over a little bit to Ezekiel, and it's an inch or two to the right. And Ezekiel is a prophet, and this prophet was confronting the nation of Israel, and this is quite a bit later in history from the book of Ruth. But God is telling Ezekiel what to say, and God is telling Israel basically he's done so much for Israel, and Israel rejected him. And he uses a metaphor here. So this is Ezekiel 16. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, make known to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was at the time the capital city of Israel and Judah, Judah specifically. Make known to Jerusalem her abominations, and say, Thus says the Lord God to Jerusalem, Your origin and birth are from the land of the Canaanite. Your father was an Amorite, your mother was a Hittite. I always think of Monty Python when I read that. But as for your birth, on the day you were born, your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water for cleansing, nor were you rubbed with salt or even wrapped in clothes. You were just lying there in a pool of your own blood, left to die. No eye looked with pity on you to do any of these things for you, to have compassion on you. Rather, you were thrown out into the open field. You were abhorred on the day you were born. When I passed by you and saw you squirming in your blood, I said to you while you were in your blood, live. Yes, I said to you while you were in your own blood, live. I made you numerous like plants of the field, and you grew up. You became tall and reached the age for fine ornaments, right? So we're using this metaphor of Israel or Judah as a baby who was left to die. The Lord says, I took you, I brought you to health, I found you a place where you could live safely and grow up. Then you reached the age for fine ornaments. Your breasts were formed, your hair had grown, yet you were naked and bare. You've reached the age of a young teenager, which is roughly the time in that culture that a young woman would usually marry, young to mid-teens, early to mid-teens. And so, in other words, in this metaphor, Israel is this girl who had grown up to be the age of marrying, but somehow she had become like destitute again. She didn't even have any clothes to wear. So I passed by you and saw you, and behold, you were at the time for love, the time to marry. So I spread my skirt over you and covered your nakedness. I also swore to you and entered into a covenant with you that you became mine, declares the Lord. Well, the covenant ultimately refers to the covenant God made through Moses. We call it the law of Moses or the Torah. But in the metaphor, this covenant is the covenant of marriage. So God says, I spread my skirt over you, and I covered your nakedness, and entered into a covenant with you. So spreading the skirt over you has directly to do with entering into this marriage covenant. Well, another thing to know, remember, hopefully, actually we may not have covered this, but Moses, when God called Moses, there was a little section that it's a little confusing, really. But after God called Moses, God saw that Moses still had not circumcised his sons. And God was basically saying, I'm calling you to lead my people out of oppression and bondage and to become their own independent nation. And you haven't even circumcised your son. That was like one of the foundational things. If you want to be part of the promise to Abraham, including this land I'm giving you, that you have to circumcise yourselves and your children. And, at a certain time, the 8th day. Well, here these sons were growing up. You've never circumcised them, and you're not taking any of this seriously. And the Bible says that God was going to kill Moses. Somehow his wife Zipporah found out about this. And I don't know if the Lord revealed it to her or whatever happened, she found out about it. She went and circumcised the children. Most likely, now she was from a place called Midian, another pagan area worshiping the Canaanite gods, and they would most likely have considered circumcision to be barbaric. You're slicing off what? That's gross. You don't do that. It's mutilation, and it's gross. So she probably said, no, you're not touching my sons, to do that. And Moses just kind of said, okay. Well, here she has to do this to save Moses' life. So she does this. She circumcises her sons and Moses' sons, but she takes the foreskins and storms over to Moses, furious, and says, "You're a bridegroom of blood to me." And she throws the foreskins at Moses' feet. Well, why Moses' feet? And it's because feet are very often symbolic of the male genitals, your privates. Don't know why, but somehow feet have directly to do with the privates. It's a sort of an intimate thing. Well, and it's not always the case. It's customary if you visit somebody that they wash your feet. You wear sandals and dirt gets all over your feet. And when you show up at somebody's house, they'll actually have servants or they do it themselves. They wash your feet for you. And it's not, there's nothing, no innuendos or anything going on there, but it is an intimate thing. But in a certain context, your feet can actually represent the private areas, reproductive organs. Well, here, Boaz laid down, he fell asleep. Ruth came and uncovered his feet and lay down. And then he, at some point in the middle of the night, he was startled and leaned forward and found a woman lying at his feet. His feet got cold. He woke up and realized there's a woman there lying at my feet. Who is it? She says, "It is Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for I am a close relative." So she does this symbolically very intimate act. And then when he wakes up and realizes what she's done, he says, "What are you doing?" She says, "Spread your covering over me. Just like God said, I spread my covering over you, Judah, and made a covenant of marriage with you." She's saying to Boaz, "Marry me." All very, very symbolic, but very clear to Boaz. And he's just shocked by this. So, he wakes up. Here's this woman at his feet. Who is it? It's Ruth. It's me. It's Ruth. Please marry me. And he's like, yes, this is all. So they make plans. He said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than your first. Instead of going after young men, whether poor or rich, you've come to me. Now, daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." I don't buy it, but he's saying you're an awesome woman. I will absolutely do this. Right? The people in the city are like, that Moabite woman, what's she still doing around? "Now it is true," Boaz said, "that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I." So apparently Boaz had done some research. I kind of wonder if maybe he was considering making the move himself. But there is a closer relative. So that's going to complicate things. So he said, "Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not want to redeem you, then I will, as the Lord lives. So lie down until morning." So twice he says, "Remain the night, and then lie down until morning. Stay with me." So she lay at his feet until morning and rose before anyone could recognize one another. And he said, "Let it not be known that this woman came to the threshing floor." In other words, Ruth, I value your reputation. And even though he's saying everybody knows what an amazing woman you are, he also, I think he's just kind of saying that. He knows that she's still that Moabite girl. And if she's seen sneaking away from the place where these men are lying down sleeping all night, she's going to be considered a prostitute. So he doesn't want that reputation for her. And but he doesn't want her to leave either. So, I know you really should leave, and I don't want anybody to see you here so you don't get a bad reputation, but stay for a while at least. I don't think anything happened that we would, as Christians today, really consider inappropriate. A lot of symbolism, though, was, the conversation was pretty shocking to that culture, people in that culture. So, I imagine they were kind of just lying there holding one another and enjoying the time together and, whispering and giggling, and then just, somebody's going to hear you, like all that stuff. Well, sure enough, first thing in the morning, she got up and left before anybody could see, before the sun was up. And then first thing in the morning, Boaz went to the town center, and they would do business at the gates of the city. So he went to the city gates, and he just waited, saying hello to everybody. He's in a really good mood that day. And this other guy comes up who's the first in line to be able to redeem not only Ruth, but the land, Naomi's land. And that would be very valuable, potentially. And so Boaz confronts the guy. He took the guy aside, sit down here, and they sat down and said, we have some business to talk about. He said, listen, you remember Naomi, right? She came back recently from that land of Moab. Well, she had to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And just wanted to let you know, I'm interested in buying that land, right? It's a great plot of land. I think I could do pretty well with it. But you are actually a closer kinsman than I am. You're a closer relative than I am. So you have first dibs at it. If you want the land, it's yours. But, you got to do it because I really am interested. If you're not, I want it. And the guy said, sure, of course. I mean, I know you want it. No, I'm sorry, but yeah, that would benefit me. I could definitely, I could probably do pretty well with a bit more land. And Boaz said, okay, no problem. It's yours. Absolutely, it's yours. Oh, one thing you need to know. Before you go and officially buy this land, there's something you need to know. Naomi, remember she left, she had the sons. Well, they died, but they were married, and one of her daughters-in-law came back. If you buy this land, if you act as the kinsman, you also have to marry that Moabite girl. Ruth, I think she calls herself, right? That Moabite girl, she's part of the deal. So if you buy the land, you have to marry the Moabite girl and be the kinsman. And the guy says, I'm not marrying that Moabite girl. No, no way. I have my own children. I have my family. There's no way I'm going to risk my inheritance for this Moabite, right? Not going to happen. And Boaz then calls around the elders and he says, okay, let's make this official. Now, there was a little nuance in the Torah that in that position, if you reject your obligation to be this kinsman, it will get passed on to the next person. But as the one who rejected your obligation, you must publicly take the sandal off your foot, hold it up. The woman that you're rejecting, the widow of your brother or whatever relative it is, spits on you, and then you are known as the man without a sandal. So, I don't know. I think that's pretty awesome myself. They didn't do, they kind of left out the whole spitting thing here. It was a formality, but the guy took off his sandal and held it up in front of the elders, saying, yes, I'm renouncing my claim to that land. I'm passing it on to Boaz. He can have the land and that Moabite girl. And Boaz says, yes. Well, they marry. Everything is good. They have a child pretty quickly. Naomi sort of became the nurse for the child. She was helping out as much as she could. The neighbor woman gave him a name, which is a little weird. People generally had a lot of names, so I don't know if the neighbors are the first one to name him or what's going on here, but the neighbors gave him a name, saying a son has been born to Naomi, and they're all celebrating this together. They named him Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David. And then the book of Ruth ends with this genealogy. So these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron. To Hezron was born Ram. To Ram, Aminadab. To Aminadab was born Nahshon. To Nahshon was born Salmon. To Salmon was born Boaz. To Boaz, Obed. To Obed was born Jesse. And to Jesse, David. Period. The end. That's how the book of Ruth ends. And we start out in the time that the judges ruled. This downward spiral into just a horrible, horrible place. And during that time, these people had to leave God's land, right? They had to leave the land that God gave to Abraham's descendants because it was so bad. The famine was horrible, everything was horrible. And then by the end of the story, we have David. In other words, things are horrible. We're in the time of the judges. It can't get much worse, but David is coming. King David is on the way. So that's the book of Ruth, foreshadowing the coming of King David and we next transition into this sort of in-between period where things almost start to look up, but don't. Just not really. But David is coming.